Bill invited us last week on Easter Sunday to think about living with eternity in mind, to live not just for this life, but as the Apostle Paul said, that if we live just for this life, we would be the biggest fools of all time, right? But to live our lives with an eye towards eternity, an eye focused on eternity. And we're spending these next 9 weeks of this series basically having Easter Sunday every Sunday with a few less people here, right? And so the way it's going to go is we're looking at these stories of the resurrection every single week for the next couple weeks. And I'm so excited for it because we get to have an opportunity to think about what this resurrected life looks like. What does life look like in light of the resurrection of Jesus? And today we're going to see that the resurrected life requires a transformed mindset. It requires a transformed mindset from us. And to see this, we're going to look at the story of Mary Magdalene in Luke chapter 24. If you want to open up there, we'll be there in a second. But this is the story of Mary Magdalene and her encounter with the resurrection. And Haley read earlier the account that John gives of their interaction. We'll see Luke's account of this moment here in a second. But it's important for us to understand who Mary Magdalene was. Because we know that Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus' followers for years at this point, for a few years. And we know from the Gospel of Luke that he recounted that Mary had 7 demons cast out of her by Jesus, their interaction. And we don't know if that's a literal 7 demons or 7 was chosen as a symbolic number, oftentimes to show wholeness and completeness. And in some ways, they're saying maybe that Mary Magdalene was wholly and completely under the control of these demons until she encountered Jesus. And he set her free in this moment. And after that, she becomes one of his followers. She becomes a financial backer of the ministry of Jesus. She's listed as one of the primary financiers of the work that Jesus was doing. And there's a myth about Mary that many of us, I think, have likely heard at some point, which is about how Mary became financially independent. Right, and the story goes, they've taken the story of the sinful woman from the Gospels, of the woman who was a prostitute, and they've merged it with Mary's life. And so there's a myth that many of us have picked up that Mary Magdalene had been a prostitute. And there's no evidence of that. The reality is that we don't know what Mary did for her money. We don't know how Mary became independently wealthy and able to finance Jesus' ministry. All we know is that she was. She was the main supporter, one of the main supporters. She was an important follower of Jesus. She's mentioned by name in the 4 Gospels 12 times. That's more than a host of the 12 disciples get mentioned by name in the 4 Gospels. She's in any list that she appears on, her name always appears first among the women, similar to how Peter's name always appeared first among the disciples. She was a core member of the team. And then Jesus died. And all 4 Gospels mention that a group of women were present at the crucifixion. 3 of them named Mary Magdalene, saying she was there at the foot of the cross for the crucifixion. That she watched Jesus die on the cross. She watched him be buried away in the tomb. And then Sunday came. And Sunday we see in Luke chapter 24 and verse 1, it says, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And when we picture this scene, when we picture this tomb, if you're anything like me, right, you can already see the Instagram post, the Facebook post in your mind, the stone rolled away, the sun shining, right? It's this beautiful picture, one tomb in a hillside. And it's possible that that's what it looked like, but more likely, there would have been a lot of tombs on this hillside. And even the tomb that Jesus would have been buried in would have been a tomb with tombs inside of the tomb, okay? Like Russian nesting doll, tombs inside of tombs here. And the way that it worked, even for the wealthiest people of Jerusalem at the time, was that this tomb was carved out of the stone, and it was the first room that you would enter in was like a shared room with a seating area, so the families could come and they could mourn at the burial. And then in the walls, they would carve out more tombs that were like slabs of stone. You can picture almost like a mausoleum today, or even like a morgue today, right? Like there's all these holes in the wall, and there would be bodies placed in them. And this is one of those moments, I think, that it's easy for us to think that the ancient world is a lot like our world, and in some ways it was, and in some ways it wasn't. And so here's a difference for us, is that when we think of a tomb, we think of someone's final resting place, right? Like you're buried in a tomb and your body stays in that tomb forever. But in the ancient world, that wasn't really the practice, especially not in the Roman Empire and Israel at the time. And so what they would do is they would put a body, a family member would die. They would take that family member and they would place them on this stone slab for a time. They would treat the body with spices and ointments. This is why Mary Magdalene and the other women are coming to the tomb to do this for Jesus. And then they would leave the body on this stone slab to decompose. And about a year or so later, depending on the time and the weather and whatnot, they would come back to the tomb and they would collect the bones from the body. And they would put them in a box called an ossuary, and they would take that box home with them to remember the dead. So every house had an ossuary. It's one of the most common artifacts we have from the ancient world, because you just have a box full of the bones of all of your ancestors, okay? That's a really different situation than our world, right? And then what would happen is that the next person in the family would die, and they would go on the slab. You owned one slab, you gotta use it. And you'd repeat this process over and over again. And so Matthew shared, it's really important in Matthew's gospel, Matthew recounted that Jesus was buried on a slab in a tomb that had never been used before. No body had decomposed where Jesus was buried, where he was placed. And so you can imagine for Mary in this way, the confusion of this moment, that she approaches the tomb, the stone has been rolled away. There's tears in her eyes. She walks into the tomb. She looks in Jesus' slab, and there's no body. So she has to start looking around the room, right? She's got to check out the other areas, like maybe he's somewhere else. She looks up here. She goes, no, that's Joseph's grandma up there. Okay, what about down here? No, that's somebody else. I don't know. Okay, where is Jesus? Confusion has set in. And it makes sense to be confused in this moment. We see it. It's totally justified confusion. And in verse 4, it says, while they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day raised again. Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb that day with the mindset that Jesus was dead. For us, we come to church on Easter Sunday and we are looking for the resurrection. We are looking forward to the proclamation that Jesus is alive. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb that day not looking for Jesus to be alive, but for him to be dead. She's searching for his body. She wasn't hoping for more. She was certain he was gone. That's why she brought spices with her. That's why she hiked all the way outside the city. That's why she searched around the tomb in confusion. And then what happens is she was confronted with the resurrection. She was confronted by these angels saying to her, why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Remember what he told you. And it changed everything for her. It changed everything for her in this instant. And Luke recounted in that moment that it's then at that point that she remembered Jesus' words. The tomb was empty. The angels tell them that Jesus was dead. And Mary Magdalene, she remembered everything and she left the tomb that day with a transformed mindset. In 1 Corinthians 13, 11, and 12, the Apostle Paul wrote that when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me, for now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. When Mary went to the tomb that day, she talked like a child, she thought like a child, she reasoned like a child. She had seen Jesus only vaguely at that point as through the reflection in a mirror. But then on that day, the tomb was empty. Jesus was alive. She saw face to face, and everything changed for her. Everything changed. A little over 300 years before Jesus, the philosopher Plato wrote a dialogue which we've come to know as the Republic. And one of the most lasting segments of the Republic that we hold on to if you're like a normal person and not a philosopher is this section called the Allegory of the Cave. And in this segment, in this allegory, Plato describes people who are shackled to the walls of a cave their entire life. And they've been shackled up since the moment of birth, and they've been forced to they can't turn their heads fully left or right, just a little bit, and they're staring at a wall across from them. And he says that behind them, where they can't see, is a giant fire. And there's men back there who walk in front of the fire and cast shadows on the wall before the people who have been chained up. And they carry with them basically puppets and structures on sticks, and they walk by with like a horse on a stick, and they walk by with bears and buildings, and these things cast shadows on the wall. And the people have spent their lives chained up, forced to watch these shadows go by. And it says in the dialogue, they say to one another, they say, undoubtedly such captives would consider the truth to be nothing but the shadows of the carved objects. Because the people in the cave, chained up in the cave, they wouldn't know any better. All they would have ever known was the shadows in front of them. They wouldn't know that really they were a poor representation of the reality outside the cave. And that was Mary Magdalene. She'd seen Jesus. She'd been following Jesus. And yet, whatever she thought Jesus was, whoever she thought Jesus was, it was a poor representation of reality. And Plato went on to describe in the allegory a person who somehow, for whatever reason, got loose from their chains. And they escaped, and they saw the fire burning behind them. They made their way out of the mouth of the cave, and they saw the sky and the trees and the sun shining. They saw the real trees before them and the real horses and the real bears, and everything suddenly changed for them. And in an instant, the shadows that they'd been staring at on the wall, they saw them for what they were, just shadows. They saw reality now laid out before them. And this person, she recognized then she had an obligation. She had a call on her life. Her job was then to go back into the cave. She had to go tell the others, you've been staring at shadows. There's so much more outside of here. There's so much more outside of this place. But Plato recounted that when she got down back into the cave, she was a laughingstock. Everyone thought she was strange. She didn't care about all they'd cared about at all for years, for their whole lives, was the shadows on the wall. And now she's coming down and saying, I don't care about shadows anymore. I don't care about these things anymore. And they thought she was strange. They thought she was weird. And again, this is Mary. It's Mary to a T, because when the women left the tomb, it says in verse 11 that they tell the apostles, they go and tell the apostles, and it says, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Their words seemed to them like nonsense. Because the disciples hadn't seen what Mary Magdalene had seen. They're still finding themselves looking only at the shadows on the wall before them. But not Mary. Mary had seen something greater. Mary had seen that Jesus was alive, and her mindset was transformed. What I want us to see this morning is that the reality is the resurrected life looks like nonsense. And I really mean that. The resurrected life looks like nonsense. Why? Because we've spent our whole lives looking at shadows, staring at shadows on the wall of the cave, and we have accepted them as normal. We have accepted them as normal and right. The disciples had spent their whole lives at least aware of the concept of a Messiah who would come, who would rescue them from Rome. A shadow really of who Jesus was. But a suffering Savior, a Savior who is crucified, who died, who would be raised back to life, that was nonsense to them. In the same way, we've spent our whole lives looking at the shadows before us. Looking at money, at family, at power, at success, at work, at sex, at friendships, at status, as the world would have us look at those things. As shadows against the wall, only a shadow of the real thing which Jesus offers us. The resurrected life, the life of following the resurrected Jesus is going to impact everything. It's going to impact how we see money, how we treat our friends, how we love our enemies, how we talk about one another, how we care for our spouses, how we act at school, how we do everything in our lives. And it's going to look like nonsense to people. As Paul said, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It's nonsense. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. There's a Christian author who I love in Philadelphia. His name is Shane Claiborne, who I think embodies this so well. And Shane Claiborne's life looks like nonsense. When he was in college, he was reading something about Mother Teresa, and so he actually went to a payphone, which still existed then. He went to a payphone, and I don't know how, but he got Mother Teresa's phone number, okay? And he called Mother Teresa from a payphone at his university, and she answered. And he said, "I would like to come to Calcutta. Can I?" And she said, "Sure, come to Calcutta, care for the sick and the dying with me." And so him and some of his friends from college went. They left their school, they went to India, they cared for the sick and the dying in Calcutta. After that, in 2003, he got to be part of a Christian group that was working to be peacemakers ahead of the war in Iraq that was looming. And so they went to Baghdad in 2003, just before the shock and awe campaign began. So he was in Baghdad when the coalition airstrikes began. And so he found himself, as the airstrikes would come to a pause, going out into the city and praying with people, caring for people, being present with people in the midst of their suffering. And after he left Iraq, he came home and he founded a community in Philadelphia called The Simple Way. And their goal was to support this struggling community, this struggling neighborhood, by living there, not by giving money to people far off, but by saying, well, let's just buy a house there and live there and help make this community better. And so they've moved in, they celebrate with the people in this neighborhood, they garden with them, they work to make the neighborhood beautiful, and he still lives there today. He makes his own clothes, and I think we have a picture of them. Very fashionable pants. He makes his own clothes because he's seen the poverty of his neighbors and he feels like he can't justify spending his money on clothes. And so he sews them himself with pockets, he says, large enough that he can fit his Bible in them, okay? That's the defining characteristic. The community he lives in has struggled at times with gang violence and fighting. And so he's become committed to ending this through juggling and unicycling. Okay, this is his claim. He's recognized that no one would keep fighting in the streets while a man who made his own pants rode a unicycle around them. And let's be honest for a second. His life looks like nonsense. It looks crazy. If you don't care about Jesus, he's a crazy person. Even if you do care about Jesus, you might be tempted to say he's still a crazy person. I think for us, that's part of the challenge. Because even as followers of Jesus, we aren't always convinced that the power of the cross. We aren't always convinced of the power of the resurrection. We aren't always convinced that we've been looking at shadows instead of the real thing before us. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb that first Easter Sunday with the mindset that Jesus was dead. And if we're being honest, I suspect that we show up to church some Sunday mornings with that same mindset. We show up to work, show up to our family gatherings, show up to our kids' schools, show up to all the places we go with the same mindset as Mary did that day, because rather than trust the power of the resurrection, rather than trust the power of the crucifixion, trust the power of Jesus, we decide that we have to do it the normal way, not the resurrection way. And I know that we do it because I do it all the time too. We're not alone in this. And yet here's my challenge this morning, not just for you, but for me as well, is to think, what would it look like to embrace the nonsense of the resurrected life? Mary Magdalene did. She heard about the resurrection of Jesus. She saw Jesus, as John recounted, and she ran back to the disciples and she told them everything. And they thought it was nonsense. But she stuck to her guns. She embraced it even when they doubted. Because she'd seen something greater. She wasn't looking at the shadows on the wall anymore. And this might be too ham-fisted of a point here, but I'm going to say it anyways. But I really think that people in the world would be much more interested in Christians who have embraced the nonsense than Christians who haven't. And I prepped a few weeks ago to preach a sermon on telling others about Jesus, and then I got sick, so Bill got to do it, and he did a fine job, right? And we're just trying to, but I'm going to slide this in here just as a second, but I think this is my little addition to this week, is that I really think that the best evangelism strategy that we have today is to embrace the resurrected life. If you want more people to know and to follow Jesus, we have to embrace the nonsense of the resurrected life. It's what Mary did, right? She went out and she embraced the craziness. She told the disciples, even when she must have known how crazy it was going to sound. The best evangelism strategy we have today is to embrace the resurrected life. It's not learning apologetics and being able to answer the questions. It's not arguing on Facebook or around the dinner table or with our grandkids. It's not even inviting people to fun things we would do here at church. It's living out such a compelling vision, such a compelling version of the resurrected life that people look at your life and they want to know more. That people would look at your marriages, look at your relationships, look at your finances, look at your time and how you spend it, and want to know why. Why do you do these things? That you could point to the resurrection of Jesus, to this one moment, and say that everything has changed for you. I think that people crave authenticity today. Doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, people crave authenticity today. A couple weeks ago, we were at Disneyland and with the kids, and I love going to Disneyland. It's a ton of fun to take the kids to Disneyland, to eat all the food at Disneyland. And I want to preface this because what I might say might sound like a critique of Disneyland. I don't want like a Disney person to get me on that front. But I love Disneyland. And so we took the kids to Disneyland. And for whatever reason, I was sitting on Main Street, on a bench on Main Street. And these two ducks hopped through the fence. And they kind of like wandered over in front of me. And I was engrossed by these ducks, okay? I was like laser focused watching these ducks. They're walking around, they're picking up the popcorn that people drop. They're kind of just sticking together. They're waddling around all adorably. And I'm watching these ducks. And I realized that other people are too. There's kids who are running over to watch the ducks. There's parents who are sitting on their benches watching their kids watch the ducks. We're all staring at these two ducks in Disneyland. And it struck me that, of course, these two ducks would attract everyone's attention because they were real. They were authentic. They weren't some carefully tailored, perfectly manicured creation of Walt Disney like Main Street is. They were just real ducks. They walked like ducks. They talked like ducks. They pooped like ducks, right? They're ducks. And I think the most meaningful contribution we can make to our kids' lives, to our grandkids' lives, to the lives of the people on our 8 to 15, maybe even to the Big C church across the world, would be to be those ducks. To so authentically live out the resurrected life with all the nonsense that it entails, to admit that we aren't perfect. To accept that we don't know all the answers, we don't have it all figured out, to recognize the places that we fall short and we can grow. To embrace Jesus' teachings, not just the catchy ones, but the difficult ones, not just the normal ones, but the nonsense ones. The resurrected life is real. It's authentic, and people want realness and authenticity so badly. They don't want to stare at shadows on a wall anymore. They don't want everything to look perfect, but be fake inside. They want real. And for us, we have this reality. We have this new mindset. Because of the resurrection, we can see the world differently, see the world correctly for all that it is. We can see the real thing, not the shadows that have been on the wall before us. What would it look like to embrace the nonsense of the resurrected life? How compelling would it be if we did? From the very beginning of our faith, it's looked like nonsense to people. One of my favorite little historical things is that one of the earliest depictions we have of Jesus crucified on a cross was a mockery. And so we found in Rome, in the Capitoline Hill on the palace of the emperor of Caesar of Rome, is graffiti that was carved in likely in the early 2nd century. You can see here on the left-hand side is what it looks like on the wall. On the right-hand side, someone has kind of traced it out so you can see it more clearly. And in the Greek that's written there, it says Alexamenos, which is the person's name, worships his God. And they've drawn Alexamenos, who was a slave for the Roman emperor, who lived in this slave house. They've drawn him worshiping Jesus. Set the horse head aside for a second. We have no idea why, but the Romans thought Jesus had a donkey head, so that's why that's there. And they're making fun of him. This slave had converted to Christianity. He'd given his life to Jesus, and everyone else took the opportunity, whoever else took the opportunity to graffiti his house and make fun of him for it. And we're not talking spray paint, right? Someone had to come chisel this graffiti into his house, very slow graffiti work, to make fun of him. Because the cross, it was foolishness. It was nonsense. From the very beginning, people have said, this is nonsense. And yet we know that's not the case. We know that it's real, that it's so much more real than anything else we could chase after. And so this morning, we have an opportunity, and I think it's perfect for us to share in communion together and to embrace in many ways what is can feel like nonsense to people. And so the band is going to come up in a moment, and we're going to close out our time together sharing in communion. And it's a moment for us to be reminded of this idea that in so many ways seems like nonsense, that God would give himself for us, that he offered himself up for us, that he would say, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you. Paul reminds us that when we take and eat, we have an opportunity to remember Jesus and his sacrifice for us. And so as we do this, I'd invite you to take a moment, consider with Jesus as we take communion this morning, what would it look like to embrace the nonsense of this resurrected life? What is Jesus calling you to? And when you're ready, I invite you, eat and drink and remember him.